anytime Jonte got into anything, toothache, headache, call my mama. I wasn't there. And that's like my biggest regret, that I wasn't there for him.
He saw the vehicle pull up. He instantly hears gunfire. Just shooting.
When you're in a relationship that is hostile and volatile and unpredictable and unsafe, you do reach a breaking point.
People do act different ways. People may be frightened, people may be angry.
It's not about love anymore. It's about property, what's mine.
17 shell casings tell a story within itself, right? It says someone wanted someone dead.
August 27th, 2017. Around 1:30 a.m., police in Detroit, Michigan respond to the scene of a terrifying car accident.
A 911 call was placed because a vehicle had crashed into a church. One of the walls in the parking lot, a vehicle had driven through the wall of the parking lot, and they believe they saw a person inside the vehicle.
Responders get to the scene, and they notice a 20-something-year-old man slumped over, barely breathing.
At those hours, it's typically pretty quiet. The person was driving eastbound on Mack Avenue. It looks like they lost control around this location. You can see the tires in the grass. He went through a 3-foot high brick wall, and then his vehicle came to a rest in a parking lot.
Upon closer inspection, officers spot evidence of a reason for the crash.
They notice bullet holes on the driver's side of the vehicle, as well as blood dripping from the man's body.
EMS now arrives and discovers that the person is shot. There's a chest wound. Now it's turning into a different investigation.
First responders are able to identify him as 29-year-old Jonte Brooks. They jump into action, and they rush him to the hospital because they try to save this man's life.
Jonte Maurice Lewis Brooks was born in 1988. His mother, Teresa Brooks, had him when she was little more than a child herself.
Jonte is my firstborn. I was really happy when he first got home, and my mom took care of him because I was just 17. So she took care of us together, you know.
Jonte grew up in a loving, close-knit family. He had 3 brothers, 1 sister. Unfortunately, Jonte's father was not in the picture, so he took it upon himself at a very early age to be the man of the family.
In high school, Jonte's charm made him popular with the girls in his class. But he only had eyes for one young woman in particular, named Dewayna.
He can stay away from her, she can stay away from him. So they were right together. They had a great relationship. They went to the prom together. It's beautiful.
They were head over heels in love with each other, and they were overjoyed when they had their first child. Not having a father in his life, Jonte took the role of being a father very seriously, so he was a very active dad.
Although they never married, the couple went on to have 4 more children together, and Jonte worked hard to support them.
Jonte eventually figured out that he thrived working with his hands and landed a career in landscaping. He took a lot of pride in his work and creating beautiful landscapes for all of his clients.
Settling down at such a young age sometimes put a strain on the relationship. But the couple always seemed to work things out.
They broke up for a second, and then they got right back together. And I knew that it was just love. They couldn't stay away from each other.
However, during one of their breaks, Jonte fathered a child with another woman. Eventually, there was no more getting back together.
Even though he and the mom eventually went their separate ways, he still prioritized co-parenting and being there for all of his children.
He was a great dad. He went, picked them up, took them wherever he went, brought them over to the house, even if he wasn't going to be there. He still had the kids there, always.
Even if he wasn't with the mothers any longer, he was right there, being a great father figure to all of them.
Really proud of him because there's a lot of men out here that have kids and just don't even recognize them. He didn't have a lot, but for sure he had those kids with him by his side, whatever he was doing.
In the fall of 2016, Jonte decided to take another chance on love with 26-year-old Mignetta Yeager.
Mignetta actually pursued Jonte, and he found this really appealing because she would take the initiative. And so she would take him out on dates, pick him up for dates, pay for things, and this was unfamiliar to someone who had to provide for everyone in his life. They had a really happy relationship, always spending time together, going on dates, and just really excited about the future.
He actually thinks that she may potentially be the one. But as in oftentimes in cases like this, there's a hiccup along the way and the relationship begins to fade and it falls apart.
By 2017, Jonte had simplified his life, focusing on spending time with his children. But now, he's clinging to life. Detroit police have determined Jonte lost consciousness and crashed into a church after someone shot him. The question is who?
There's no guns in the car. There's no passenger in the vehicle. So obviously, somebody from outside the vehicle fired into the car. We try to figure out, one, his motive. Was this person an intentional target? Was it an accident?
Witnesses tell police a truck was pursuing Jonte shortly before he crashed.
Several witnesses noticed the white minivan seemed to be trying to get away from the red pickup truck. However, once the white minivan crashed into the church, the red pickup truck fled the scene. They were not able to see the license plate. However, they did notice there were two people in the vehicle, a man and a woman.
Unfortunately, none of them saw the shooting.
Officers surveyed the scene and noticed there are no shell casings at the church. They realized the shooting must have occurred somewhere else.
We would call that a two-part scene. The secondary crime scene would have been where he was found. The original crime scene would be where he was shot.
One theory was that this was possibly a road rage incident, because that's what normally happens if you see one vehicle chasing another down the road.
In that specific area, we haven't responded to too many homicides. There is a little bit of prostitution over there. There's some breaking and entering of automobiles and stolen cars and things of that nature. Now, the investigative wheels are spinning to where this could have happened at.
As officers are surveying the scene, they notice down the street at the gas station, there are multiple cars and blue flashing lights. And they wonder, is this part of the current scene?
In the early morning hours of August 17, 2017, Detroit police begin their investigation into the shooting of 29-year-old Jonte Brooks. Before they've even finished interviewing witnesses, they receive some tragic news.
Unfortunately, the paramedics were not able to save his life, and he does die at the hospital. He was killed from a single bullet that went through his right shoulder and went through his lungs.
So now you have a murder investigation. And now, where was he murdered?
Flashing lights from patrol cars at a gas station nearby tip off officers to the possible location.
Coincidentally, there's a crime scene just down the street, second call that had come in for shots fired at the gas station. Officers at the scene were quickly able to determine that the two incidents were connected.
When investigators arrive, they find evidence of a relentless attack. 17 spent shell casings scattered on the ground.
Officers notice all 17 shell casings are the same, so they seemingly come from the same weapon, meaning there's probably just one shooter. After Jonte was shot, he tried to get away. Unfortunately, he succumbed to his injuries, swerved, and drove right into the church and crashed.
You have a two-part scene, so we would have to break those two up and then have evidence techs or our crime scene services section document each location.
17 shell casings tell a story within itself, right? It says someone wanted someone dead.
Officers talked to the gas station owner, and he says he then noticed a red pickup truck pull up and a white minivan pulled up right next to it. He heard some arguing and heard some gunshots, about 6 or 7 of them.
The owner tells police that when he ran to the window, he caught a glimpse of the shooter.
The gas station owner noticed it was a young black woman shooting at the white minivan. At this point, the white minivan pulled out and sped off. The woman followed, shooting on foot at the white minivan, then jumped back into the red pickup truck and tried to follow him.
Unfortunately, he's unable to provide a description of the driver or the license plate.
People don't look out the window and expect a homicide to happen and say, I'm documenting it step by step by step. I'm looking at my watch. Okay, it's now. They're not doing that. You know, you're busy doing this. All of a sudden you hear something, you look, and you only capture this much.
Luckily, the gas station has security cameras covering the entire area.
What's better than the witness account is the video at the store, which captures the event in its entirety from start to finish.
Officers review the surveillance footage, and they notice an older black man driving the vehicle and a young black woman in the passenger seat. She's on her phone, and she seems very animated as she's talking. At this point, a white minivan pulls up beside them with the window rolled down. They start to argue, and the young lady jumps out of the vehicle and starts shooting at the white minivan.
Based on the video footage, there wasn't any delay, there was no physical contact, there wasn't any of that.
The video provides investigators with enough information to identify the driver.
Not only does the surveillance footage show the shooting happening, it also reveals the license plate of the vehicle. They're able to tell the vehicle belongs to 44-year-old LeBaron Borum. The officers check his DMV photo, and they notice there is a resemblance to the person in the surveillance video. The officers also realize he lives in the neighborhood of the gas station.
From that, we did surveillance and were able to locate the vehicle parked in the driveway. And from there, we were able to locate and eventually interview the owner of that red pickup.
Ultimately, police arrive at LeBaron's door, and they have questions for him.
At this point, he's the one that ultimately gets to decide what role he wants to play in this investigation. In these investigations, typically when you have multiple defendants, whether it's a bank robbery with 4 or 5 defendants or a homicide with 3 or 4 defendants, typically the first person that comes to the table to talk to the prosecutors will get the best outcome.
And he spills it all. It ends up being a very wild night and a wild scene.
Detroit police are questioning 44-year-old LeBaron Borum, one of 2 suspects identified at the scene of Jonte Brooks' murder. According to LeBaron, he was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time.
He says he was strictly trying to be a good Samaritan, and he just got caught up in a very bad situation.
LeBaron says it began with an argument between two strangers on his front lawn.
LeBaron tells the officers his son ran into the house and told him, "Dad, there's a van that ran up onto our yard." At this point, LeBaron went outside to see what was going on.
What he says is that he notices there's a female and a male, they're arguing, there's some type of altercation going on. Ultimately, he says the male gets into the vehicle, and it appears that he's about to run the female over. She ultimately gets out of the way, and he drives on in this white van.
LeBaron tells the officers he does recognize the lady from the neighborhood. It is 27-year-old Minnietta Yeager.
He knew the man arguing with Minnietta as well. It was her ex-boyfriend, Jonte Brooks.
What he stated was that he was aware that Miss Yeager and Mr. Brooks were in a tumultuous type of relationship.
By the time LeBaron came to her aid, Jonte had already driven away.
He went to help Miss Yeager, thinking that this was a woman in distress. And she ultimately says, "Hey, yes, can you go after this white van? That's my mother's van. I gotta get it back. I'm concerned. My boyfriend just attacked me and he took the van." He had no clue that she had a gun on her. So he ultimately lets Miss Yeager into his vehicle, and they drive off looking for this white minivan.
While they were chasing Jonte, Minnietta called police to report the van stolen. Then she called Jonte.
Miss Yeager said her plan was to try to keep Jonte on the phone as long as possible so the police can get to him and he could be arrested.
There's some heated words being said back and forth. Ultimately, he also hears that they agreed to meet up on the east side of Detroit at a gas station in the area of Van Dyke and Warren Avenue. And this would have been around 1 o'clock in the morning on August 27th. When they get to the gas station, there's no Jonte. And so, she instantly calls Jonte on her phone. She argues with him, "Why didn't you show up?" Well, apparently he did show up because he says that he noticed that she was in a vehicle with another man. He's not too happy about that, according to her, and he has choice words. She indicates to LeBaron that he ultimately makes a threat towards her, saying he's gonna kill them.
At this point, LeBaron was reconsidering his decision to get involved. But he ultimately agreed to drive to another gas station.
LeBaron tells the officers Jonte pulled up about a minute later. But then they started arguing because he was highly upset.
He says something to apparently push her buttons. She immediately gets out the vehicle and pulls out a weapon. And she starts to fire into the vehicle that Jonte is in.
Mr. Brooks, without hesitation, just hit the gas and took off. In the course of the shots being fired at the vehicle, Mr. Brooks was shot.
But the harrowing encounter wasn't over yet.
At this point, LeBaron is terrified. He didn't know what just happened. He wanted to just get out of there. However, Ms. Yeager jumped back into the vehicle and told him to just drive.
As Jonte is attempting to get away, he's obviously shot and he's obviously hurt because he then pulls into the lot of a church which is nearby on Mack Avenue, and at that point collapses. LeBaron seeing this and Miss Yeager seeing this as they're chasing him, they then decide to pull off and keep going. What LeBaron indicates to the police is that he noticed some lights behind him and, he freaks out.
He saw the police coming and he did not want to be a part of that at all.
He decides to turn down a side street. He ultimately makes his way back home. And strangely enough, he says that Miss Yeager just gets out the vehicle and walks back home. Doesn't say a single word. And from that point, he says he doesn't hear from her ever again. In fact, he doesn't hear anything else until police arrive at his door.
Investigators believe LeBaron is telling the truth. Unfortunately, his actions still make him an accessory to murder.
I don't know if Miss Yeager was intentionally trying to kill Mr. Brooks, but her reckless display of firing a weapon and her disregard for life or anything, the outcome was ultimately homicide. So here we are.
He is ultimately charged as an accessory after the fact. And police charged him because he helped her flee the scene. And then he doesn't immediately go to police.
Hours after the murder of Detroit native Jonte Brooks, investigators are searching for the woman accused of shooting him. Jonte's ex-girlfriend, Minyetta Yeager. They also reach out to Jonte's loved ones to notify them of his death.
That Sunday morning when I woke up, I'm in Vegas. I woke up, I looked at my phone. My phone is flooded with missed texts and messages. So I listened to one of my voicemails. It was my youngest son. And he said, "Ma," he was crying. He said, "Ma, I can't believe this. This girl killed your son." I called home. I said, "What is going on?" My youngest son said, "Ma, I just got back from the hospital. I had to view him. He said she killed your son." I just lost it. I lost it.
After recovering from the initial shock, Jonte's family tells police they feared something like this might eventually happen.
What we had learned through the investigation was it was a tumultuous relationship.
So while things started out great in the beginning for Jonte, the transition happened when things got a little more hostile in the relationship. So Miss Yeager started calling him a lot, stalking him, accusing him of being with other women, popping up unannounced at his family's house.
I always heard her in my home, but I never cared to meet her or anything because she was loud, Every time she came to my house, she was always loud. And I just told him that, she can't come over no more because she's very disrespectful. And he said, okay.
When partners start showing that behavior of calling him a lot, accusing him of being with other women, at first we take that as a sign of, they like me, they're crazy about me. That behavior tends to get ignored a lot until it's very problematic, right? But at that point, it's a pattern and you find yourself stuck in a relationship, right? That's unhealthy.
I know there was a lot of 911 calls back and forth for the domestic situations between her and him. So there was definitely, from a long-term perspective, there was a buildup.
Jonte's loved ones became even more concerned when they discovered Minyetta's family had a history of violence.
Unfortunately, Minyetta was no stranger to this type of violence. Her sister years prior had murdered her ex-boyfriend and his current girlfriend.
I told my son, I said, "Jonte, Minyetta is dangerous. Stay away." He was young. He said, "Okay, I know, Mom, I know." But he didn't.
In August 2017, 2 weeks before Jonte's murder, the family says he and Minyetta got into a heated argument.
Miss Yeager was very erratic and emotional at this time. Jonte's mother showed the police officers her Ring camera. And it shows Mrs. Yeager standing outside her house, banging on the door, yelling for Jonte to come out. He refuses to come out. However, finally, he does come to the door.
They got into it. She bust out all my windows in my front of my house. And then she also bust out the window in my car.
But despite Minietta's alleged violent outburst, Jonte refused to get police involved.
In a case where you have the male that's the victim, what we oftentimes see is that they don't go to authorities for numerous reasons. One is they're not believed. Those type of cases, unfortunately, aren't taken seriously. And also, it's that male stigma, right? You want to be tough, and to go to police or to go to friends or loved ones and say, hey, I'm being abused by this female, well, takes a little way away from your masculinity. So men feel a little ashamed. You rather walk away. And that's what Jonte was doing here.
Crazy.
Instead, he finally decided to break up with her.
August 27th, that's the day he got killed. But that Friday before, I talked to him, and he was like, Mom, I see what everybody is saying. I gotta get away from this girl. I say, Jonte, I agree. He said, I got to get away.
When you're in a relationship that is hostile and volatile and unpredictable and unsafe, you do reach a breaking point, and you don't want to hear from that person anymore. You cut them off completely, and a lot of times that is not well received.
The night before he died, Jonte agreed to meet up with Minietta one last time.
What we know is that on August 26th, Jonte is contacted by Miss Yeager, and she's insistent. She wants to meet with him. She wants to talk. He's trying to tell her, no, it's over. I'm moving on. There's nothing else, I need to talk about. And she wants to meet him at his aunt's house, which is not far from where she lives.
Minietta was always bribing him with money and gifts. Even if he says no, she will still come around. If he don't react the way that she want him to react, she will sit in the driveway and just blow on the horn, just lay on the horn. So this particular night, she did this. Jonte didn't want no problems, because this was my sister's house. And she was beating on the door at first. My sister came to the door and told her that Jonte is asleep. So she go back to the car and just lays on the horn at my sister's home. Jonte came outside and, he went with her.
Just a few hours later, Jonte was dead. And now, investigators can't find Minietta anywhere.
They've been cabin sitting the neighborhood. They put a bolo out. At this point, they even go to the news media because they cannot find her anywhere.
This is on 11 o'clock news, 6 o'clock news, and ultimately someone does see and does give information. It's her, it's Miss Yeager herself.
Less than 24 hours after fatally shooting her ex-boyfriend, Jonte Brooks, Minietta Yeager turns herself in to Detroit police.
She was transported to our holding facility, which is the Detroit Detention Center, and I went and interviewed her there. But I believe that she had an opportunity to speak with a lawyer before she turned herself in, so our interview was very short.
The story Minietta tells police is quite different from the one they've heard so far. Minietta claims she's the one who ended the relationship with Jonte, not the other way around.
She says she was abused by Jonte for months now. And at this point, she went to the mother's house because she finally had the courage to break up with him. She says that once she told him that she wanted to break up, he went crazy.
According to Minietta, Jonte is the abuser in the relationship. And on this night, she says that he pulled her out of the van, beat her up, even beat her with a pistol at one point.
She finally was able to get away and run away from him. But no, he took the van and tried to run her over. At this point, LeBaron was there and she saw him and he offered to help.
Mignetta says she asked LeBaron to drive her to the gas station, intending to get her van back from Jontay. As she got out of LeBaron's truck, he handed her a gun to protect herself.
She says, in fact, that it was LeBaron who had the weapon and that she was simply there to just talk to Jontay. But she takes the weapon. She's in fear. She's in natural fear. She doesn't know what Jontay's gonna do. She says ultimately, out of self-defense, she shoots at Jontay. That she probably shot once or twice, 2 or 3 times at most. But then she tells police that her memory is foggy about the exact details.
Investigators are skeptical of her claims.
But it didn't make much sense because, you know, she says that she was abused and he was the abuser, but yet she's pursuing him. There's evidence that shows that she's appeared at his mother's house on a couple of occasions and, you know, threw a brick through the mother's windshield, tried to attack him when he opened the door to have a conversation. She says she shot 2 or 3 times at most, but we know from the physical evidence that there were 17 shell casings there at the gas station.
The police had a tough job in this situation because on one hand, we have Mignetta, who is reporting abuse, and then on the other hand, they also have contradicting reports where she was the abuser.
In a situation of domestic violence, you'll see signs of abuse. You'll see black eyes, you'll see broken noses, you'll see fat lips and cuts and scars and things of that nature. But in this situation, I don't remember any type of injuries to her. Now, there was a day or two that had passed, so could have something healed. I'm sure there's probably some doctors that could argue one way. There's some doctors that could probably argue the other. However, in this situation, I didn't see anything obvious.
I think that people in general expect a bad woman to act and look a certain way, that this person is going to be meek and timid and scared and crying. And in my experience, you don't know how you're going to act. People do act different ways, so we have to investigate.
Mignetta's statement also raises another question.
Miss Yeager said LeBaron gave her a gun, but LeBaron said Miss Yeager just brandished the gun. So where did the gun come from?
It's a very important detail because if LeBaron, in fact, did hand her this weapon, well, maybe this is not a first-degree murder case. Maybe this is a second-degree murder case or manslaughter.
When investigators re-interview LeBaron Borum, he says Mignetta is lying.
LeBaron says he doesn't own a gun, does not have one registered to him or anything. The police even search his home and do not find one.
But Mignetta doesn't appear to have the gun either.
In murder cases, oftentimes the defendant, especially when they've had time to flee the scene and head home, they'll discard the weapon, they'll throw it somewhere, they'll hide it someplace, they might pass it on to someone else. Police did search for the weapon but couldn't find it, which is not unusual. But they have enough evidence.
There's a misconception that you need a firearm to prove a homicide occurred or to charge somebody with homicide. That's not true.
The video evidence is pretty damning in and of itself.
On August 30th, 2017, Mignetta Yeager is charged with first-degree murder. At her arraignment, she shows little remorse.
It was like around her birthday, and she told the judge, well, can we get this on? I want to get out of here. And the judge say, Miss Mignetta, this is a homicide right here. You're not getting out that fast. The stuff But he had a nice funeral.
Nearly a year later, in August 2018, his accused killer, Minetta Yeager, goes on trial.
Ms. Yeager's crux of her defense was that she was the one being abused. She was the only person who could testify to that, so she had to take the stand if that's what she wanted to do. And she wanted to do that, so she took the stand, and didn't work out very well. Ms. Yeager indicated there were a couple people that tried to help her when he was assaulting her just previous to this homicide. That didn't bear out. These people, they were never found. There were no visible injuries.
Minetta is a liar. She was saying that he was beating on her. If he was beating on you, why all the time you're at my house? Why I have to always ask my son to keep you away? We couldn't keep you away.
Prosecutors focus on the night of the shooting, arguing the evidence clearly shows Minetta was the aggressor.
Video evidence was very specific to show that Miss Yeager went to that gas station with one intention, and one intention only, and that was to seek revenge to Mr. Brooks for taking her vehicle. She didn't get out of the car and flag him down and stop him and say, let's talk, reach her hand out for the exchange of keys. The wheels were still rolling, and she was already out of the neighbor's vehicle and firing at Mr. Brooks. In domestic violence situations and tumultuous relationships, it's not about love anymore, it's about property, what's mine, and I think people ultimately become property to each other as well. You belong to me.
In previous situations, Jonte had kind of acquiesced. This time he was staying true to what he wanted, and he drove off from her, and she did not know how to respond to that, and that led her into a rage.
After a 3-day trial, the jury finds Minetta Yeager guilty as charged.
We were able to have Ms. Yeager convicted of first-degree murder, and that is mandatory life in prison in the state of Michigan.
And the judge asked her, did she have anything to say to me or the family? She said no. She was looking directly at Duana and really smiling, which is evil, pure evil.
LeBaron Borum is also convicted of being an accessory after the fact. He serves less than 2 years in prison.
Whenever you get a guilty verdict on any case, but especially on a homicide, there's a sense of a job well done, that all of your hard work is paid off, and you're especially glad to get that justice for the family. But there's always going to be that sense of loss, and you can never make that family whole.
Everybody tells me that I have to forgive her. I would never forgive her. Never forgive her. This is my firstborn. She took him away from me, but I don't have anything to say to her. People say hate is a strong word. I want to go above hate. I hate her, and God understands my pain. I don't have to forgive her.
London, 1888. Long before the city became a symbol of progress and empire in history books, there was another London that most people preferred not to see. It lived beyond the polished storefronts, beyond the wealthy neighborhoods lit by elegant gas lamps, beyond the grand houses where politicians, businessmen, and aristocrats ended their evenings in comfort. East of the city, where narrow streets twisted between decaying brick buildings and the smell of coal smoke mixed with sewage, another world struggled to survive. Every morning, thousands woke up uncertain whether they would find work, food, or even a place to sleep before the next sunrise. Poverty was not simply part of life there. It was the air people breathed. Among those streets stood Whitechapel. To outsiders, it was a district to avoid after dark. To those who lived there, it was simply home. Its alleys were crowded with dock workers, factory laborers, immigrants escaping hardship from across Europe, widows with nowhere else to go, children who learned to beg before they learned to read. And women whose choices had slowly disappeared one by one until selling companionship became the only way to pay for a bed for a single night. Boarding houses overflowed with strangers packed shoulder to shoulder. If someone failed to earn just a few pennies before sunset, they could easily find themselves sleeping outside in the cold. The streets never truly became silent. Boots echoed across uneven stones. Horse carts creaked through muddy intersections. Arguments drifted from public houses. Laughter, desperate and forced, escaped from tavern doors before disappearing into the darkness. And somewhere beyond it all, hidden between the sounds of an ordinary night, someone was watching. No one noticed him. No one remembered his face. No one could even agree if they had ever seen him at all. That uncertainty would become the beginning of one of history's greatest mysteries. More than a century has passed since those nights in Whitechapel. Entire generations have lived and died. 2 world wars have reshaped Europe. Science has transformed criminal investigations with fingerprints, DNA analysis, surveillance cameras, and digital records. Thousands of murder cases once considered impossible have eventually found answers through modern forensic techniques. Yet one name continues to resist every attempt at certainty. Jack the Ripper. It is a name recognized across the world, whispered in documentaries, debated by historians, examined by detectives, and dramatized in countless books and films. But behind the legend lies something far less glamorous than popular culture often suggests. Behind the infamous nickname are real streets where fear settled over entire neighborhoods. Behind every newspaper headline stood grieving families who never imagined their loved ones would become permanent chapters in criminal history. The mystery has never truly belonged to the killer. It belongs to the people whose lives were interrupted forever. The story has been told so many times that the unknown murderer often becomes the central character, while the women he killed slowly fade into the background, remembered only as names attached to a mystery. History has a strange habit of turning tragedy into legend, and legends into entertainment. But before there was an unsolved case, before there were theories, suspects, and endless speculation, there were ordinary people trying to survive another difficult week in Victorian London. None of them knew they were walking toward history. The first hints appeared so quietly that almost nobody paid attention. Violence was not unusual in Whitechapel. Drunken fights happened almost every night. Robberies were common. Domestic abuse rarely attracted official concern. People disappeared. Bodies were occasionally discovered in dark corners of the district. Death itself had become almost routine. Police officers working these streets had seen enough suffering to believe they understood the neighborhood. They knew its criminals, its gangs, its dangerous alleys, and its endless cycle of poverty. Whatever happened next, they assumed it would resemble the crimes they had investigated before. They were wrong. Somewhere inside the maze of Whitechapel, someone was developing a pattern. Not a sudden explosion of violence. Not an emotional argument. Not a robbery gone wrong. Something colder. More deliberate. The attacks seemed almost calculated, completed with remarkable speed before the killer vanished back into the darkness without leaving witnesses capable of identifying him. There were no dramatic chases through London streets. No heroic confrontations. No desperate confessions. Only silence. The silence became its own kind of evidence. Imagine standing beneath one of Whitechapel's gas lamps during those early hours before dawn. The light barely reached the ground, leaving long shadows stretching across wet cobblestones. The morning fog softened every outline until people became moving silhouettes rather than recognizable faces. A stranger could pass within a few feet without revealing more than the shape of a hat or the outline of a coat. In such conditions, certainty disappeared. A witness might remember seeing a man. Another might remember a different hat. Someone else insisted the stranger carried a small parcel. Another swore he carried nothing at all. Each recollection sounded convincing. None matched perfectly. The city itself seemed determined to protect whoever moved through its darkness. As news spread from one lodging house to another, conversations slowly changed. People who usually complained about unemployment now lowered their voices when discussing the latest rumors. Landladies warned women not to walk alone. Public houses emptied earlier than usual. Doors that once remained unlocked through the night were suddenly secured before midnight. Every unfamiliar face attracted suspicion. Every shadow invited another story. Rumors multiplied faster than facts. Some insisted the killer must be a doctor because of the injuries found on certain victims. Others argued no educated gentleman would ever wander through Whitechapel after midnight. Some believed the murderer was a local laborer who knew every shortcut between buildings. Others imagined a wealthy man secretly crossing social boundaries after sunset. Every theory sounded possible. None could be proven. The newspapers recognized something extraordinary almost immediately. Victorian Britain loved sensational stories, but this felt different. Editors understood that fear sold newspapers better than almost anything else. Every edition promised fresh discoveries. Every headline suggested the police were closer than ever to solving the mystery. Every rumor found new life in print before investigators had time to verify it. Readers consumed every word. Morning papers passed from hand to hand inside factories. Customers argued over articles inside taverns. Street vendors shouted headlines across crowded intersections. People who had never visited Whitechapel suddenly imagined its streets in terrifying detail. Fear spread far beyond East London. It spread through imagination. That may have been the killer's greatest advantage. Not merely remaining unseen. Remaining unknowable. Because once people stop recognizing danger, they begin inventing it everywhere. A man walking alone after midnight became suspicious. A butcher carrying knives home from work attracted nervous glances. Foreign accents inspired whispers. Loners invited speculation. The city started investigating itself long before police could identify a suspect. Meanwhile, the real killer, or whoever he truly was, continued to exist somewhere within that atmosphere of suspicion. Perhaps he blended into crowds. Perhaps he greeted neighbors every morning. Perhaps he looked so ordinary that nobody considered him memorable. History offers no answer. Even today, after generations of research, investigators cannot agree on his identity. Hundreds of suspects have been proposed over the decades. Some were doctors. Some were butchers. Some were sailors, immigrants, laborers, artists, even members of respected society. Books have accused dozens of different men. Modern forensic theories have challenged older conclusions. Alleged breakthroughs have appeared, only to collapse under closer examination. Every answer eventually creates new questions. And perhaps that is why this case continues to haunt people more than a century later. Most unsolved crimes slowly disappear from public memory. This one refused. It became larger than the investigation itself. Children grew up hearing the name. Detectives inherited dusty files from previous generations. Historians searched forgotten archives. Psychologists attempted to reconstruct the personality of someone whose face remains unknown. Novelists imagined motives. Filmmakers invented endings. Yet the historical record stubbornly ends where certainty should begin. No arrest. No trial. No confession accepted beyond doubt. Only fragments. Only possibilities. Only victims whose final moments remain surrounded by unanswered questions. But every mystery has a beginning. Not with a famous nickname. Not with sensational newspaper headlines. Not with endless theories debated for more than a century. It began with ordinary people living ordinary lives in one of London's poorest neighborhoods, unaware that the streets they walked every evening were about to become the setting for one of the most infamous criminal investigations in history. Before the world knew the name Jack the Ripper, Whitechapel knew only hunger, exhaustion, and survival. Soon, it would learn something even darker. The fear did not arrive all at once. It seeped into Whitechapel the way the autumn fog rolled through its streets, quietly, almost unnoticed at first, until one morning people realized they could no longer see beyond the next corner. In neighborhoods where hardship had always been the greatest enemy, another threat was taking shape. This one had no face, no known address, no recognizable pattern that ordinary people could avoid. It did not knock before entering. It waited for the city to lower its guard. To understand why these murders left such a permanent scar on history, it is necessary to understand the rhythm of Whitechapel itself. Life here was measured one day at a time. Most residents had little opportunity to think about next month, let alone next year. Every sunrise meant another search for work. Every evening brought the same question: would there be enough money for a meal, a bed, or neither? The lodging houses that lined Whitechapel's streets offered shelter for only a few pennies. Those who could not afford even that were turned away without hesitation. It did not matter whether the weather was cold or wet. Rules were rules, and the owners had no shortage of desperate customers waiting outside. For many women, the difference between sleeping indoors and spending the night in the open came down to finding just enough money before the last doors closed. There were no safety nets waiting beneath them. One missed opportunity could become hunger. One illness could become homelessness. One cruel decision could change the course of an entire life. Many of the women later connected to the Whitechapel murders had once lived lives that looked surprisingly ordinary. Some had married. Some had children. Some held steady employment before illness, alcoholism, financial hardship, or family breakdown gradually pushed them toward the margins of society. Their stories were not unusual for Victorian London. They were simply among thousands of people who disappeared into poverty so slowly that almost nobody noticed until they had already fallen. That is one of the quiet tragedies surrounding this case. History remembers them because of the way they died. Far fewer people remember how they lived. As summer faded into autumn in 1888, Whitechapel remained crowded long after sunset. Markets closed, but pubs stayed busy. Dock workers finished exhausting shifts and searched for warmth before heading home. Street vendors packed away what little merchandise remained unsold. Children disappeared indoors while adults lingered outside, hoping the next conversation might lead to work the following morning. Gas lamps struggled against the darkness. They illuminated circles of yellow light while leaving everything beyond those circles swallowed by shadow. A person could step from brightness into darkness in a single stride, becoming little more than an outline against brick walls stained by decades of smoke and rain. Police patrols walked their assigned routes, but there were never enough officers to cover every alley and courtyard. Whitechapel contained countless narrow passages that twisted unexpectedly between buildings, creating blind corners where someone could vanish within seconds. Even officers familiar with the neighborhood admitted there were places they preferred not to enter alone after midnight. Still, murder on the scale that was about to unfold seemed almost unimaginable. When people later looked back at those weeks, many claimed there had been warning signs. They spoke of uneasy feelings, strange encounters, suspicious strangers lingering beneath street lamps. But memory has a way of reshaping itself after tragedy. Once fear enters a story, every forgotten detail begins to feel significant. Every coincidence starts resembling a clue. The truth is simpler. Nobody knew. Nobody looked into the eyes of a passing stranger and realized they were seeing the person who would one day become the most infamous unidentified killer in modern history. The newspapers would eventually give him a name that echoed across generations, but during those first days he was simply another invisible figure moving through London's largest city. Perhaps he appeared respectable. Perhaps he looked exhausted after work. Perhaps he blended perfectly into the crowds because there was nothing remarkable about him at all. That possibility remains among the most unsettling aspects of the case. History often imagines monsters as visibly different from everyone else. Reality is rarely so accommodating. The streets themselves offered countless opportunities to disappear. Horse-drawn wagons rattled over uneven cobblestones, creating constant background noise. Factory whistles marked the passing hours. Coal smoke drifted low across rooftops. The smell of damp brick, horse manure, and open drains lingered in the air. Visibility changed from one minute to the next as patches of mist thickened between buildings. Even today, Visitors walking through modern Whitechapel sometimes struggle to imagine the district as it existed in 1888. Much has changed. Roads have been widened. Buildings have disappeared. New generations have replaced the old. Yet beneath those changes lies the memory of a neighborhood that once became the center of worldwide attention for reasons nobody wished to claim. As reports of violence spread, anxiety reshaped daily routines. Conversations became shorter whenever unfamiliar faces approached. Mothers insisted their daughters return home before dark. Men who once laughed off neighborhood gossip now found themselves checking over their shoulders during late-night walks. Public confidence in the police began to weaken as each passing week produced more questions than answers. The Metropolitan Police faced enormous challenges that modern investigators rarely encounter. Crime scenes could not be sealed with forensic tape because such procedures did not yet exist. Curious neighbors wandered close to investigations. Reporters competed fiercely for information, often publishing speculation alongside verified facts. Witnesses came forward in large numbers, but their statements frequently contradicted one another. Human memory, especially during moments of fear, proved as unreliable then as it does now. Without fingerprints, DNA analysis, surveillance cameras, or reliable forensic databases, investigators depended almost entirely upon observation, interviews, and physical evidence that could easily be overlooked or contaminated. Every missed detail carried consequences. Every mistaken assumption sent valuable time slipping away. And time was exactly what the killer seemed determined to exploit. One of the enduring mysteries surrounding these crimes is the remarkable speed with which the attacks appear to have occurred. Investigators believed that the murderer struck swiftly, completed his actions within minutes, and disappeared before anyone nearby realized what had happened. Whitechapel was densely populated, yet somehow the killer repeatedly escaped without being positively identified. Was it luck? Was it careful planning? Or did he understand the neighborhood so well that every escape route had already been chosen before the crimes even began? More than a century later, historians still debate those questions. The uncertainty extends far beyond the identity of the murderer. Researchers continue to disagree about aspects of the investigation itself. Some argue that certain victims almost certainly belonged to the same offender, while others question whether every murder traditionally linked to Jack the Ripper was committed by a single individual. The 5 victims most commonly known as the canonical 5 remain the strongest historical consensus, but even within that framework, interpretation often differs from one expert to another. That uncertainty is important. It reminds us that history is not a perfectly preserved recording. It is a collection of documents, witness statements, newspaper reports, official records, and human memories, all carrying their own imperfections. The further we travel from 1888, the more carefully each surviving piece must be examined. Perhaps that explains why this case continues to attract investigators long after every original witness has disappeared from history. Unlike mysteries solved by one decisive piece of evidence, the Whitechapel murders resemble an unfinished puzzle with several pieces permanently missing. Every generation believes it might finally discover the missing connection. Every generation eventually confronts the same uncomfortable reality. Some questions may never receive complete answers. Yet unanswered questions possess extraordinary power. They refuse to stay buried. They invite imagination where certainty cannot exist. They challenge every confident conclusion. For that reason, Jack the Ripper became more than an unsolved murderer. The case evolved into a mirror reflecting the fears of every era that revisited it. Victorians feared a hidden predator stalking the darkness. 20th-century criminologists searched for psychological patterns. Modern researchers turned toward forensic science, hoping technology could succeed where 19th-century policing had failed. Still, despite every advance, the central mystery survives. Not because people stopped looking. Because the evidence left behind belongs to another century. But before theories multiplied, before newspaper headlines transformed an unknown killer into an international legend, before investigators argued over suspects whose names would fill countless books, there were 5 women whose lives intersected with that darkness one by one. Their stories did not begin with murder. They began with ordinary hopes, disappointments, difficult choices, and relentless attempts to survive another day in Whitechapel. The first of those stories belonged to a woman named Mary Ann Nichols. Her death would become the moment when scattered fears hardened into something far more terrifying. The streets of Whitechapel were about to change forever. The first light of morning rarely brought hope to Whitechapel. It revealed what darkness had merely concealed. Broken windows reflected pale sunlight. Rainwater settled in shallow ruts carved into the streets by countless wagon wheels. Chimneys released thick columns of smoke that drifted low across rooftops, carrying the smell of burning coal through every narrow lane. The city was already awake long before dawn, not because its people were eager to greet a new day, but because survival demanded an early start. For those living in the wealthy districts of London, Whitechapel existed as little more than a name on a map, a place associated with crime, overcrowding, and poverty. Many had never walked its streets. They imagined it as a distant world despite being only a few miles away from the elegant boulevards where expensive carriages rolled past fashionable shops and gentlemen discussed business over breakfast. The contrast between the two Londons was almost impossible to ignore. West London represented opportunity. East London represented endurance. In Whitechapel, nearly every street told a story of struggle. Entire families occupied single rooms scarcely large enough to hold a bed. Children slept beside parents, grandparents, and siblings with little privacy and even less comfort. Damp walls trapped the cold throughout the winter months, while summer brought foul odors from overcrowded drains and overflowing refuse. Disease spread quickly in neighborhoods where clean water was not always easy to obtain and sanitation remained painfully inadequate. Life expectancy reflected these conditions. Many people died young. Those who survived often carried the visible marks of hardship across their faces long before old age arrived. Employment, when available, was rarely secure. Men gathered near docks before sunrise hoping to be selected for a day's labor unloading cargo ships. Hundreds competed for jobs that only a fraction would receive. A strong back and willing hands offered no guarantee of work. Those turned away returned home empty-handed, already wondering how they would explain another unsuccessful day to hungry families waiting behind thin wooden doors. Women faced equally unforgiving realities. Some found employment sewing clothes for factories, scrubbing floors in wealthier neighborhoods, washing laundry, or preparing food. The wages were painfully low, and the hours stretched endlessly. Others, especially those abandoned by husbands or struggling with addiction, found those opportunities disappearing altogether. Without stable employment, many drifted toward casual prostitution, not because they viewed it as a career, but because it often became the only remaining way to earn enough money for shelter before nightfall. Victorian society judged them harshly. Whitechapel understood them differently. Its residents knew that desperation rarely announced itself through dramatic decisions. It accumulated slowly, one unpaid rent payment, one illness, one lost job, one family tragedy at a time. By the time someone reached the streets, years of hardship had usually paved the way. That truth often disappeared beneath newspaper headlines. The women who later became victims would frequently be described only by the occupations they held near the end of their lives. Yet reducing them to those final circumstances ignores everything that came before. They had once been daughters. Some had been wives. Some had cared for children. They laughed, celebrated birthdays, formed friendships, argued with neighbors, dreamed about better futures, and worried about ordinary problems long before history remembered them for entirely different reasons. Whitechapel itself reflected that complexity. It was easy for outsiders to describe it as dangerous, but danger alone did not define the neighborhood. Markets filled the streets during daylight hours. Bakers opened before sunrise, their windows filling with warm bread purchased by customers who counted every coin carefully before making a decision. Tailors worked tirelessly beneath dim light. Children invented games in alleyways despite constant warnings from exhausted parents. Churches attempted to provide comfort. Charitable organizations distributed food and temporary shelter whenever resources allowed. Even amid relentless poverty, life continued. People still fell in love. Neighbors still helped one another. Births were celebrated. Weddings took place. Communities formed despite every obstacle. This ordinary humanity makes the events of 1888 even more haunting. The murders did not occur inside an abandoned wasteland. They happened within a living neighborhood filled with people whose daily routines would soon be interrupted by fear. As evening approached each day, Whitechapel transformed. Businesses closed one by one. Street vendors packed away their remaining goods. Factory workers emerged into fading daylight with tired shoulders and empty stomachs. Public houses gradually filled with customers seeking warmth, conversation, and perhaps temporary escape from another difficult week. Some drank to celebrate finding work. Others drank because they had failed to find any at all. Gas lamps flickered into life as darkness settled across the district. Their glow reached only a short distance, leaving much of each street swallowed by shadow. The farther someone walked from those pools of light, the easier it became to disappear. Modern cities rarely experience darkness in quite the same way. Electric lighting exposes sidewalks, intersections, and storefronts throughout the night. Surveillance cameras watch from nearly every direction. Passing vehicles provide constant movement. Whitechapel in 1888 offered none of those reassurances. Silence often arrived unexpectedly. A person could turn into a narrow passage and find themselves completely alone within seconds. Brick walls absorbed sound. Mist softened distant footsteps. Even familiar streets seemed unfamiliar after midnight. Police officers understood these challenges better than anyone. Their patrols covered enormous areas on foot. They carried little more than lanterns, whistles, and personal experience. Communication between officers depended upon runners or fixed police stations rather than radios. If trouble occurred several streets away, assistance could take valuable minutes to arrive. Those limitations shaped every investigation. When a crime occurred, officers relied heavily upon local residents. Shopkeepers remembered familiar faces. Landlords recognized regular customers. Neighbors noticed unusual behavior. In close-knit communities, informal observation often became as valuable as official policing. But Whitechapel's population changed constantly. Seasonal workers arrived seeking employment. Immigrants settled temporarily before moving elsewhere. Lodging houses welcomed strangers every evening and watched them disappear again the following morning. Someone could remain almost invisible simply by avoiding close relationships. That possibility would become increasingly significant as investigators searched for a murderer whose identity remained frustratingly elusive. The social tensions within Whitechapel added another layer of complexity. The district contained people from many different backgrounds, languages, and cultures. Jewish immigrants fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe lived alongside Irish labourers, English dockworkers, and families from numerous other communities. Most residents simply struggled to survive together, but economic hardship sometimes fueled suspicion between groups. Whenever fear grows, prejudice often follows. The murders intensified those existing tensions. Rumors spread rapidly through crowded streets. Some blamed foreigners without evidence. Others accused local criminals already known to police. Every unfamiliar accent, unusual profession, or solitary lifestyle became the basis for fresh speculation. Newspapers occasionally amplified those suspicions instead of calming them, publishing dramatic stories that reached readers far beyond Whitechapel. The Metropolitan Police suddenly found themselves confronting not only an unknown killer but also a frightened public demanding immediate answers. Public confidence depended upon visible progress. Yet progress proved painfully slow. Investigators worked tirelessly, interviewing witnesses, following leads, and examining crime scenes with the tools available in the late 19th century. However, the absence of modern forensic science meant that many questions simply could not be answered. There were no latent fingerprints to compare. No DNA profiles waiting inside laboratory databases. No security footage recording movements before or after the crimes. Every conclusion depended upon careful observation, witness testimony, and educated interpretation. History would later judge many investigative decisions harshly, but such criticism often benefits from hindsight. Detectives in 1888 operated within the scientific limitations of their own era. They pursued hundreds of leads, examined numerous suspects, and coordinated one of the largest homicide investigations Victorian Britain had ever seen. Still, the killer remained free. Perhaps the greatest advantage belonged not to the murderer himself but to the environment surrounding him. Whitechapel's crowded streets, transient population, poor lighting, and limited policing created conditions in which an individual familiar with the area could move with remarkable freedom. Whether by careful planning or extraordinary fortune, the person responsible repeatedly vanished before certainty could catch up with him. As autumn deepened and evenings grew colder, residents began altering their routines in subtle ways. Conversations lingered less frequently outside public houses. Some women chose to walk together whenever possible. Shopkeepers locked their doors earlier. Families worried whenever loved ones failed to return home on time. Fear does not always announce itself through panic. Sometimes it appears in smaller habits. A quicker glance over one shoulder. A faster pace beneath fading light. A hesitation before turning into an empty street. Whitechapel was learning those habits one by one. No one yet understood that the neighborhood itself was becoming a character in one of history's most enduring criminal mysteries. And within that neighborhood lived the women whose lives would forever be linked to a name that did not yet exist. Before newspapers transformed the unknown killer into a legend, before detectives debated suspects, before historians filled libraries with competing theories, there were ordinary human stories unfolding quietly behind the brick walls and crowded lodging houses of East London. The first of those stories begins not with death, but with a woman trying, like thousands around her, to make it through one more ordinary day. Whitechapel was a place where people learned to adapt. Adaptation was not a choice. It was a necessity. Those who lived there understood that the rules of survival were different from the rest of London. In wealthier neighborhoods, a bad week might mean losing a luxury or postponing a purchase. In Whitechapel, a bad week could mean losing everything. A single illness could remove a worker from employment. A single missed payment could mean losing a room. A single argument could separate someone from the fragile support system that kept them alive. There was little room for mistakes. The streets taught people to become observant. Residents learned which alleys were safer, which taverns attracted trouble, which landlords were willing to offer another night of shelter, and which streets became almost empty after dark. Children grew familiar with hardship at an age when others were still protected from the realities of the adult world. They learned the language of survival before they learned the language of ambition. For many children in Whitechapel, childhood was brief. Some worked alongside their parents. Some sold newspapers on street corners. Some carried messages between businesses. Others simply wandered the streets because their homes were too crowded and uncomfortable to remain inside for long periods. Their small figures moving through the district became part of the daily landscape. Nobody found it unusual. Poverty had become normal. That was perhaps the most dangerous thing about Whitechapel. Not the violence. Not the crime. Not even the darkness after midnight. It was the way suffering became invisible. When people see hardship every day, they can become numb to it. A person sleeping against a building wall becomes part of the scenery. Someone asking for help on a street corner becomes background noise. A woman walking alone late at night becomes another figure among thousands. Until suddenly she is not. Until suddenly the world notices. But often, by then, it is too late. The women who lived on the edges of Whitechapel society carried stories that rarely reached beyond their immediate circles. Their struggles were personal, private, and often ignored by official institutions. Records preserved their names only briefly. Newspaper reports focused more on the crimes committed against them than the lives they had lived before. That imbalance would become one of the most painful aspects of the Whitechapel murders. The victims became symbols. But they had once been individuals. They had favorite foods. They had personal habits. They had friendships. They had memories that existed beyond the final moments of their lives. Their existence was not defined by the person who ended it. The neighborhood itself contained countless examples of people attempting to rebuild their lives despite impossible circumstances. Charitable organizations operated soup kitchens and shelters. Religious groups offered assistance. Some volunteers walked through the poorest streets distributing food and clothing. Their efforts helped many, but the scale of poverty was overwhelming. The city was growing faster than it could care for its people. London in the late 19th century was the center of the British Empire, one of the most powerful cities on earth. It represented wealth, innovation, and influence. But greatness existed alongside desperation. The same city that displayed magnificent buildings and international power also contained overcrowded districts where families struggled to afford basic necessities. This contradiction defined Victorian London. Progress and suffering existed side by side. A gentleman could leave a theatre wearing an expensive coat, pass through streets filled with horse-drawn carriages, and within a short distance encounter people who had not eaten properly in days. Many wealthy Londoners rarely entered Whitechapel unless business required it. To them, it was a distant problem. To those living there, it was home. By 1888, tensions throughout the district had already been building for years. Poverty created frustration. Competition for work created resentment. Limited resources created conflict. The arrival of large numbers of immigrants added another layer to an already complicated social environment. The majority of residents were not criminals. They were workers. They were families. They were people trying to create stable lives in unstable conditions. But the district's reputation made everyone who lived there suspicious in the eyes of outsiders. That reputation would later influence the investigation. When murders began occurring, many people immediately assumed the killer must belong to the world they already feared. They imagined someone violent, someone obviously dangerous, someone who could be recognized easily. But criminals do not always announce themselves. Sometimes they disappear because nobody thinks to look at them. The Whitechapel murders challenged one of the most common assumptions about crime: that danger always looks dangerous. The unknown killer moved through a community where everyone was already struggling. He existed among people too focused on survival to study the behavior of strangers. He benefited from a city where thousands passed through daily, where anonymity was easy to achieve, and where the line between neighbor and stranger was often impossible to define. This was the environment in which the murders unfolded. Not an empty ghost town. Not a forgotten corner of civilization. A living, breathing neighborhood. A place where people worked, argued, celebrated, suffered, and dreamed. A place where thousands of ordinary moments happened every day. And then, in the spaces between those ordinary moments, something horrific began. The first victim was not discovered in some remote location far from human activity. She was found within the very streets where people lived and worked. The location itself sent a message that would terrify the community. If someone could be attacked there, under those circumstances, then perhaps nobody was truly safe. That fear spread quickly. People began searching for explanations. Was the killer a stranger who had entered Whitechapel? Or someone who had always been there? Was he intelligent and organized? Or simply fortunate? Did he choose his victims randomly? Or had he been watching them? Every question created another possibility. Every possibility created another rumor. The police needed facts. The public demanded answers. But the streets offered only fragments. A witness remembered a figure. Another remembered a conversation. Someone noticed unusual behavior. Someone else saw nothing at all. The investigation would soon become a battle between evidence and speculation. And speculation had one powerful advantage. It moved faster. The newspapers were already preparing to transform tragedy into a national obsession. The public appetite for information grew stronger with every report. Readers wanted a villain. They wanted a face. They wanted a simple explanation for something that felt impossible to understand. But real investigations are rarely simple. Behind every theory was uncertainty. Behind every suspect was a lack of proof. Behind every headline was a human tragedy. As September approached, Whitechapel continued its daily routine. Workers left their homes before sunrise. Shopkeepers opened their doors. Children filled the streets. Women searched for ways to earn enough money to survive another night. The district did not know it was standing at the beginning of a historic investigation. It did not know that police officers, journalists, and historians would one day examine these same streets looking for answers. It did not know that every small detail, the location of a building, the timing of a patrol, the words spoken by a witness, would become part of a mystery studied for generations. At the center of that mystery were people who had never asked to become famous. They wanted only ordinary things. A safe place to sleep. Enough money for food. A chance to escape hardship. A future that offered something better than yesterday. But history would remember them differently. Their names would become connected forever to the darkest months Whitechapel had ever known. And the first name the world would hear was Mary and Nichols. Before the world knew their names, before newspapers printed descriptions of their final moments, before historians debated every detail of their deaths, they were simply women trying to survive. They were not characters in a mystery. They were not symbols of fear. They were not merely entries in a police file. They were human beings who had once walked through the same streets as everyone else in Whitechapel. They had hopes, disappointments, memories, and moments of happiness that existed long before the darkness surrounding their final days. The tragedy of the Whitechapel murders is not only that a killer was never identified. It is also that the lives of the victims were often overshadowed by the mystery itself. The world became fascinated with the person who committed the crimes, but the women who suffered became secondary in the story. Their names were repeated alongside a famous nickname, yet their voices were almost completely lost. To understand the true weight of what happened in 1888, we must first look beyond the headlines. We must meet the women before history remembered them. The first of those women was Mary Ann Nichols. Born in London in 1845, Mary Ann grew up in a working-class environment where life was demanding but not without ordinary moments of joy. Her father, Edward Walker, worked as a locksmith, a skilled trade that provided a modest but respectable living. Like many families of the period, the Walkers lived with the constant realities of Victorian London, long working hours, limited opportunities, and the pressure to maintain stability in a rapidly changing city. As a young woman, Mary Ann entered adulthood during a time when expectations for women were strict and unforgiving. Marriage was often seen as the foundation of security. A woman's future was closely tied to her husband's ability to provide, and when that stability disappeared, there were few protections available. Mary Ann married William Nichols, a printer's machinist, in 1864. For a time, their lives appeared to follow the path many people hoped for. They built a family together and eventually had several children. From the outside, they seemed like an ordinary Victorian household. But ordinary lives can change quietly. The marriage between Mary Ann and William eventually deteriorated. Financial difficulties, personal conflicts, and years of hardship placed increasing pressure on their relationship. By the late 1870s, the marriage had broken down, leaving Mary Ann separated from her husband and struggling to maintain a stable life. In another era, with different social systems, her circumstances might have led to new opportunities. In Victorian London, they often led to isolation. Mary Ann attempted to rebuild her life. She worked where she could, including positions as a domestic servant. She tried to remain connected to her family. Like many women facing poverty, she moved between temporary arrangements, always searching for the next opportunity. But each setback made survival more difficult. There was no simple path back. There was no guaranteed support waiting when someone fell into hardship. For women without financial security, the margin between independence and desperation was painfully thin. Eventually, Mary Ann found herself living in the poorest areas of London. By 1888, she was known by the nickname Polly among people who knew her. She lived in lodging houses and relied on occasional work and whatever income she could find. Like many women in similar circumstances, She sometimes turned to prostitution to earn enough money for shelter. This was not a glamorous world. It was a world of survival. Women in this situation often had no control over how they were viewed by society. Newspapers frequently reduced them to a single description. Their struggles, their families, and their histories were pushed aside. Mary Ann Nichols was more than the circumstances of her final years. She had once been a daughter. She had once been a wife. She had once been a mother. She had children who knew her not as a name connected to a crime, but as a person who had been part of their lives. The distance between those two images is where the tragedy truly exists. A woman can experience years of hardship and still remain a person filled with memories and emotions. A difficult life does not erase a human identity. In the weeks before her death, Mary Ann's life had become increasingly unstable. She struggled with poverty and alcohol dependency, another common reality among people living under extreme stress in Victorian London. Alcohol was often not only a source of addiction but also an escape from circumstances that offered little comfort. For many poor residents, the public house became one of the few places where warmth, conversation, and temporary relief could be found. But every escape came with a cost. Money spent on drink meant less money for food. A night spent away meant another difficult morning. The cycle continued. On the night before her death, Mary Ann was seen moving through Whitechapel. Like countless other nights, she was looking for money. Like countless other nights, she was trying to secure a place to sleep. Nobody around her knew that this night would be different. Nobody watching her walk through those streets could have imagined that her name would one day be studied by investigators across the world. The final hours of Mary Ann Nichols' life remain filled with unanswered questions. Where exactly had she been? Who had she spoken to? Did anyone notice the person who approached her? Did anyone pass her on the street shortly before her death? History has preserved only fragments. Those fragments tell us what happened afterward. They tell us how she was found. They tell us how police responded. They tell us how a quiet corner of Whitechapel suddenly became the center of international attention. But they tell us very little about her thoughts during those final moments. That absence is one of the most painful parts of the case. A crime investigation searches for evidence. But behind every piece of evidence is a person whose life cannot be reconstructed completely. Mary Ann Nichols was the first victim commonly linked to Jack the Ripper. Her death became the beginning of a terrifying pattern. But for those who knew her, she was not the beginning of anything. She was someone they had shared meals with. Someone they had spoken to. Someone whose voice had once been familiar. Someone whose absence left an empty space. On the morning of August 31st, 1888, the people of Whitechapel woke up expecting another ordinary day. Workers prepared for employment. Shopkeepers opened their doors. Families continued their routines. The city moved forward without knowing that a discovery made in a dark street would soon change everything. Before the name Jack the Ripper became known, before fear spread across London, there was only Mary Ann Nichols. A woman whose life had already been difficult. A woman who had spent years fighting circumstances beyond her control. A woman whose final moments would create a mystery that would survive for more than a century. And she would not be the last. The story of Mary Ann Nichols was the first chapter in a tragedy that would soon expand beyond one woman, one street, and one neighborhood. But as investigators began examining the circumstances surrounding her death, another name would enter the growing darkness surrounding Whitechapel. Annie Chapman. Like Mary Ann, Annie was not born into the world that history would eventually associate with her. She was not born as a victim. She was not born as a name in a criminal investigation file. She entered life with the same uncertainty and possibilities as anyone else of her time. Her story began in a very different environment from the one where it ended. Annie was born Eliza Ann Smith in London in 1841. Her father, George Smith, had served in the military, and her childhood was shaped by the traditions and expectations of Victorian society. Her family was not wealthy, but they belonged to a respectable working-class world where discipline, responsibility, and reputation mattered deeply. During this period, A person's social position could determine almost every aspect of their life. Where they lived, who they married, what opportunities they received, how others judged them. For women especially, security often depended on relationships and family structures that could disappear with a single tragedy. As a young woman, Annie married John Chapman, a man who worked as a coachman. The couple moved through different stages of life together, attempting to build the kind of household that many Victorian families hoped to achieve. They had children. They worked. They created memories. For a time, Annie experienced something many people in Whitechapel later struggled to find: stability. But stability in the 19th century was fragile. Illness, death, unemployment, and personal hardship could destroy years of effort within a short period. The Chapman family eventually faced painful losses. Some of their children died young, a heartbreaking reality that many Victorian families experienced due to limited medical knowledge and widespread disease. The emotional impact of such losses was enormous, leaving wounds that often remained hidden behind the necessity of continuing daily life. People in that era rarely had the luxury of stopping to grieve. Life demanded that they continue. Eventually, Annie's marriage began to collapse. Like many relationships affected by hardship, the reasons were complicated. Financial pressure, personal struggles, and changing circumstances slowly created distance between husband and wife. By the time Annie reached her later years, the life she once knew had transformed dramatically. She had become separated from the security she had once possessed. She moved between temporary homes. She searched for ways to support herself. The woman who had once belonged to a family household became someone navigating a city where thousands of people lived on the edge of survival. Annie became known by the nickname Dark Annie, a name believed to refer to her appearance, particularly her dark hair and complexion. Those who knew her described a woman who could be friendly and sociable, someone who enjoyed conversation and maintained relationships despite the difficulties surrounding her. This detail is important because it reminds us that people living through hardship were not defined only by their struggles. Annie Chapman was not simply someone who lived in poverty. She was someone who had relationships. Someone who was recognized by neighbors. Someone whose presence mattered to people around her. By 1888, however, Annie's circumstances had become extremely difficult. She lived in temporary accommodations, including common lodging houses where poor residents paid small amounts for a place to sleep. These locations were crowded and uncomfortable, but for many people they were the only alternative to sleeping outdoors. Every night in such places carried uncertainty. Would there be enough money for a bed? Would there be enough money for food? Would tomorrow bring work? These questions followed people constantly. Annie, like many women in similar circumstances, sometimes relied on prostitution as a way to survive. It was a dangerous existence, exposing women to violence, exploitation, and constant risk. Yet for those with limited options, immediate survival often mattered more than distant consequences. Outsiders often judged these women without understanding the circumstances that brought them there. But the reality was far more complicated. A person does not suddenly become desperate. Desperation is usually the result of countless small losses accumulating over time. A broken relationship. A lost income. A lack of support. A world that offers fewer and fewer opportunities until choices become almost impossible. Annie Chapman's final days reflected this painful reality. She was living in the heart of Whitechapel, surrounded by thousands of people experiencing similar struggles. The streets were filled with movement and noise, yet many individuals living there carried their problems alone. On the evening before her death, Annie spent time attempting to earn enough money to secure basic necessities. She spoke with people in the area. She moved through familiar streets. She followed routines that had become normal for someone living in those conditions. Nothing about that night suggested that history was approaching. No one around her knew that her name would soon appear in newspapers across Britain. No one knew investigators would later examine every detail of her final hours. No one knew that her death would intensify the fear already beginning to spread after Mary and Nichols' murder. Annie Chapman's life ended in the same environment where she had struggled to survive, among the crowded streets, poor housing, and forgotten corners of East London. But the tragedy of her story is not only what happened to her. It is also what came before. A woman who had once built a family. A woman who had known love. A woman who had experienced loss. A woman who continued moving forward despite circumstances that repeatedly pushed her backward. When newspapers later described her, they focused on the crime. The world wanted details about the unknown killer. The public wanted explanations. The police wanted evidence. But Annie's own story became quieter beneath the growing investigation. Her dreams, fears, and memories could not be recovered from a crime scene. Her voice could not be questioned by detectives. Her version of events disappeared with her. This is the painful reality behind historical true crime cases. The investigation often preserves the actions of the offender more clearly than the lives of the victims. The person responsible becomes a subject of endless analysis, while those who suffered are remembered only through the tragedy that ended their lives. But Annie Chapman was never meant to be remembered only as a victim. She was a person who lived for nearly 5 decades before one morning in September 1888 changed everything. Her life contained more than the final moments recorded in police documents. She had a childhood. She had a marriage. She had children. She had ordinary days that never appeared in newspapers. And yet, by the time investigators began studying the crime that took her life, the question dominating public attention was no longer about who Annie Chapman had been. It was about who could have done this. The discovery of her death marked a terrifying escalation. The first murder had shocked Whitechapel. The second created a frightening possibility. The possibility that Mary Ann Nichols had not been the victim of an isolated act of violence. The possibility that someone was hunting within the streets of London. And somewhere in the city, hidden among thousands of ordinary people, the person responsible was still free. The names of Mary Ann Nichols and Annie Chapman would soon become permanently linked to one of the most infamous criminal investigations in history. But before fear consumed Whitechapel, before the streets filled with rumors and suspicion, 2 more women would enter the story. Their lives, like those before them, were not defined by the way they died. They were defined by everything that came before. The next victim was Elizabeth Stride. Unlike some of the other women whose lives had become increasingly unstable over many years, Elizabeth's story carried a different kind of tragedy. Her life reflected the difficult journey of someone who had experienced moments of ordinary happiness, only to see that stability gradually disappear. She was born Elizabeth Gustafsdotter in Sweden in 1843. Before she became known to history as Elizabeth Stride, she belonged to another country, another culture, and another life. She grew up in a rural environment, far from the crowded streets of Victorian London. Her early years were shaped by the traditions of Swedish village life, where communities were smaller and relationships more familiar. As a young woman, Elizabeth moved toward adulthood during a time when opportunities for women were limited. Many women's futures depended heavily on marriage, family connections, and economic circumstances beyond their control. She eventually moved to Stockholm, where she worked as a domestic servant. Like many young women of her generation, Elizabeth sought employment wherever opportunities existed. Domestic service was one of the most common forms of work available to women, but it was demanding and often provided little independence. Her life changed dramatically after she became involved with a sailor named John Stride. The couple married in 1869 and eventually moved to London, hoping to build a new future together. For a period of time, Elizabeth experienced something that many people in Whitechapel desperately wanted. A home. A family. A sense of belonging. The couple ran a coffee and lodging business, attempting to create financial stability through their own work. It was not an easy life, but it offered structure and purpose. Then tragedy entered. Like many families of the 19th century, Elizabeth and John faced losses that would have devastating consequences. Their business struggled. Their relationship suffered. Economic difficulties placed increasing pressure on their lives. Eventually, their marriage collapsed. Elizabeth found herself separated from the life she had once built. By the 1880s, she was living in East London, surrounded by the same poverty and uncertainty affecting thousands of others. She used the name Elizabeth Stride, a name connected to her marriage, even though that relationship had already become part of her past. Those who knew her described a woman who was generally quiet and polite. Some remembered her as reserved, while others described her as friendly. She had acquaintances throughout Whitechapel and maintained connections with people in the neighborhood. Again, this detail matters. The victims of Jack the Ripper were not isolated figures existing only at the edge of society. They were part of communities. People knew them. People spoke with them. People saw them walking through the same streets every day. Elizabeth, like the others, lived within a network of familiar faces. But familiarity did not guarantee safety. By 1888, Elizabeth was surviving through a combination of casual work and prostitution. She lived in rented rooms and relied on small amounts of income to continue from one day to the next. Her life had changed from the dreams she may once have held. But even in difficult circumstances, people continue to find moments of normality. They continue conversations. They continue friendships. They continue searching for reasons to believe tomorrow might be different. That was the reality of Elizabeth Stride's final days. She was not walking through Whitechapel believing she was part of a historical event. She was simply trying to survive another night. The fourth victim was Catherine Eddowes. Her story began in Wolverhampton in 1842, before she eventually became another woman whose name would be forever connected to the Whitechapel murders. Catherine grew up in a working-class family and later moved through different parts of England searching for stability. Like many people of the period, her life was shaped by employment, family responsibilities, and circumstances that could change suddenly. She worked in various occupations and eventually entered a relationship with Thomas Conway. Together, they had children and attempted to create a family life. 4 years, Catherine experienced the responsibilities and challenges familiar to countless working-class women. She cared for children. She managed households. She worked when she could. She tried to build something permanent in a world where security was difficult to maintain. However, her relationship with Conway eventually deteriorated. Catherine later became involved with John Kelly, a laborer, and the couple moved through different areas of London before settling in Whitechapel. Those who knew Catherine described her as energetic and intelligent. She was known to have a strong personality and could be lively in conversation. Friends and acquaintances remembered aspects of her character that rarely appeared in newspaper reports after her death. She had humor. She had opinions. She had a presence. She was not simply someone passing unnoticed through the city. Yet, like so many people living in poverty, her circumstances became increasingly difficult. Catherine and John Kelly lived in a lodging house where they paid for temporary accommodation. Their survival depended on small earnings and careful decisions. Every day involved choices between immediate needs: food, shelter, clothing. The basic necessities that many people take for granted today were constant concerns for those living on the margins of Victorian society. By the autumn of 1888, Catherine's life had become intertwined with the same streets where the previous murders had taken place. The fear spreading through Whitechapel did not stop people from living. Workers still went to factories. Families still searched for food. People still walked the streets because they had no alternative. For those living in poverty, avoiding danger was not always possible. Sometimes danger existed on the same streets they needed to use every day. The final victim commonly associated with Jack the Ripper was Mary Jane Kelly. Her story was different from the others in several important ways. She was younger than most of the women connected to the case, believed to have been born around the mid-1860s. While much of her early life remains uncertain, historians believe she came from Ireland before eventually making her way to London. Mary Jane's life contained many unanswered questions. Even her background remains debated. But what is clear is that she lived through a period when young women without family support were especially vulnerable. By the time she reached London, she was living in an environment where poverty could quickly remove every layer of protection someone had. Mary Jane became known as a woman of striking appearance and strong personality. People who knew her described someone who could be cheerful and outgoing despite difficult circumstances. She lived in a small rented room in Miller's Court, a place that offered more privacy than the common lodging houses many poor residents depended upon. That small room would later become the location of the final and most notorious murder associated with Jack the Ripper. But before that terrible morning, it was simply her home. A place where she kept her belongings. A place where she rested. A place that represented whatever independence she could maintain. This detail is often overlooked. A home, no matter how poor, is still a personal space. It contains pieces of a person's identity, their possessions, their memories, their sense of safety. The violence that occurred there shocked investigators because it represented a different level of intrusion. The killer had moved from the public streets into a private room, a place where people normally expected protection from the outside world. By the time Mary Jane Kelly's name became connected to the investigation, Whitechapel had already changed. The neighborhood was no longer simply poor. It was afraid. But fear can sometimes cause people to forget something essential. Behind every investigation file is a human life. Behind every newspaper article is a person who once mattered to someone. Behind every historical mystery are real families who carried the consequences long after the headlines disappeared. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. 5 women whose lives crossed paths with one of history's darkest mysteries. They came from different backgrounds. They had different experiences. They carried different memories. But they shared one final connection. Their deaths would create a question that generations would attempt to answer. Who was Jack the Ripper? Yet before that question could dominate the world's attention, before detectives searched for suspects and newspapers created legends, the investigation had to begin. And it would begin with a discovery in the early morning darkness of August 31, 1888. The moment when Whitechapel's ordinary streets became the scene of a crime that would echo through history. The night of August 30, 1888, arrived like countless nights before it. Whitechapel did not know it was standing at the edge of history. The streets carried on with their usual rhythm. Workers finished their long shifts and returned home with tired faces. Horse-drawn carts moved through narrow roads, their wheels cutting through damp streets. Public houses remained filled with people searching for warmth, conversation, and a temporary escape from the struggles waiting outside. The city was alive. But beneath the ordinary movement of London's East End, something unseen was approaching. For Mary Ann Nichols, it was another night of uncertainty. She had spent years navigating a world where survival depended on small amounts of money earned day by day. She knew the streets of Whitechapel well. She knew where people gathered, where she might find someone willing to help her, and where she could perhaps earn enough to secure a place to sleep. But that night, like many nights before it, circumstances were against her. Mary Ann was living in a reality familiar to thousands of poor residents in Victorian London. There was no comfortable distance between everyday life and danger. The same streets used by workers returning home were also places where vulnerable people searched for survival after midnight. Darkness was not merely the absence of light. It was a barrier. It hid faces. It concealed movements. It created moments where one person could disappear while hundreds of others remained unaware. As midnight approached, the streets slowly changed. The noise of the evening began to fade. Shopkeepers closed their doors. Families settled inside their homes. The busiest roads became quieter. The people who remained outside were those whose lives required them to continue moving through the night. Among them were women like Mary Ann. The exact events of her final hours remain uncertain. This is one of the most haunting aspects of the case. History preserves the aftermath more clearly than the moments before. Investigators could examine where she was found. They could document evidence. They could question witnesses. But they could never fully reconstruct what happened during the final minutes of her life. The unknown space between those moments has remained for more than a century. What we do know is that shortly before her death, Mary Ann was seen in Whitechapel. She was attempting to earn enough money to find shelter for the night. She spoke with people in the area. She moved through streets she had likely walked many times before. Nothing suggested that this would be her last journey. Nothing warned those around her. A person walking past might have seen only another woman trying to get through another difficult night. That ordinary appearance is what makes the crime so disturbing. The victim was not separated from society. She was moving within it. Somewhere nearby, someone was watching. The exact location where Mary Ann was discovered was Bucks Row, a narrow street in Whitechapel, later renamed Durward Street. At the time, it was not a place known for attracting attention. It was simply another working-class street in a district filled with thousands of similar streets. Buildings stood close together. Factories and warehouses occupied nearby areas. Workers passed through regularly. Yet in the early hours of August 31st, the quiet of Bucks Row was broken. Around 3:40 in the morning, a man named Charles Cross, a cart driver on his way to work, noticed something lying on the ground. At first, he believed it might be a discarded piece of clothing. The darkness made it difficult to see clearly. He moved closer. Then he realized it was a person. A woman. She was lying motionless on the street. Cross called another passerby, Robert Paul, who was also heading to work. Together, they approached the body. The two men did not immediately understand the full horror of what they had discovered. In the dim early morning light, they saw only enough to know something was terribly wrong. A woman had been attacked. They alerted the authorities. Within a short time, police arrived. The discovery transformed an ordinary street into the center of an investigation. Officers examined the area carefully, but the challenges facing them were immediate. The crime had occurred in darkness. There were no modern barriers protecting the scene. No cameras had recorded movements. No digital records could reveal who had passed through the area. The investigation depended on physical evidence and human memory. Two things that were fragile and easily lost. When the body was examined, investigators identified the victim as Mary Ann Nichols. The news traveled quickly. At first, many people in Whitechapel struggled to understand what had happened. Violence was not uncommon in the district, but this crime felt different. There was something about the circumstances that unsettled even those familiar with hardship and death. The murder appeared deliberate. The victim had not simply been robbed. Nothing suggested a random confrontation. The attack showed a level of violence that caused investigators to question what kind of person could commit such an act. The police began searching for answers. Who had seen Mary Ann that night? Who had spoken to her? Who had been near Bucks Row? Had anyone noticed a stranger? Had anyone heard something unusual? The problem was that Whitechapel was full of people who had reasons to be outside during those hours. A worker leaving early. A resident returning home. A person searching for shelter. A stranger passing through. Everyone became a possibility. And yet, no one provided the certainty investigators needed. The murder also created another problem. Was this an isolated crime? Or was it something more? At first, detectives could not know. A single murder, even a brutal one, did not automatically suggest a pattern. They had investigated countless violent incidents before. Perhaps this was another tragedy caused by someone whose identity would eventually be discovered. But certain details troubled them. The method. The apparent speed. The lack of obvious motive. The feeling that the victim had been selected rather than simply encountered. These questions remained unanswered. For the people of Whitechapel, however, the most immediate reality was simpler. A woman who belonged to their community was dead. Someone had taken a life on their streets. And whoever had done it was still somewhere nearby. The fear that would later define the district had not yet fully arrived. The public did not yet know that Mary Ann Nichols would become the first name connected to a series of murders that would capture international attention. At that moment, she was simply a woman whose life had ended in a dark street before dawn. A mother. A daughter. A person who had spent years fighting against circumstances that offered little mercy. Her final moments created the beginning of a mystery. But her life had existed long before that mystery. The investigation would focus on the person responsible. The newspapers would focus on the horror. The public would demand answers. But for those who knew Mary Ann, the tragedy was much more personal. A familiar face was gone. A voice they recognized would never be heard again. A place in their community had been permanently emptied. And as the sun rose over Whitechapel on the morning of August 31st, London had no idea that it had just witnessed the first chapter of a mystery that would remain unsolved for generations. The death of Mary Ann Nichols changed the atmosphere of Whitechapel in a way that was difficult to describe. At first, the neighborhood reacted as it always had to tragedy. People gathered. People talked. People searched for explanations. In a district where hardship and violence were familiar, many residents had learned to continue living despite terrible events. They had seen accidents in factories, fights outside public houses, illnesses that took lives without warning, and families destroyed by poverty. But this felt different. The murder carried a sense of uncertainty. It was not simply that someone had died. It was that someone had entered the ordinary world of Whitechapel and committed an act that seemed impossible to understand. The streets where people worked, traded, and returned home each night suddenly felt less familiar. Neighbors began looking at familiar corners differently. A narrow passage that once offered a shortcut now appeared threatening. A stranger standing alone at night attracted attention. A person walking behind them created unease. Fear rarely arrives as a single moment. It grows through small changes. A door locked earlier than usual. A conversation that becomes quieter when someone unfamiliar approaches. A person choosing a longer route home because it feels safer. Whitechapel was beginning to change. Meanwhile, the police investigation moved forward. The officers assigned to the case faced an enormous challenge. They were searching for a person who had left behind very little information. They had no clear description of the attacker. They had no reliable witness who could identify the killer. They had no scientific methods available that modern investigators would consider essential. They had only fragments. A location. A victim. Physical evidence. And a growing number of unanswered questions. In 1888, criminal investigation was still developing. The Metropolitan Police had existed for decades, but forensic science remained in its early stages. Investigators relied heavily on experience, observation, and the ability to question people effectively. The idea that invisible biological evidence could connect a suspect to a crime scene was still far in the future. There were no databases. No laboratory tests capable of revealing identity. No technological system tracking movements through a city. A detective's greatest tools were his eyes, his memory, and his understanding of human behavior. But even the most skilled investigator could not recover information that had never been recorded. The streets of Whitechapel had witnessed something terrible. Yet they had preserved very little. The police began examining Mary Ann Nichols' final movements. They searched for anyone who might have seen her during the early morning hours. They spoke with residents. They questioned people who worked nearby. They attempted to reconstruct a timeline. Every witness statement became a small piece of a much larger puzzle. But the puzzle was missing many pieces. Some people remembered seeing a woman. Some remembered seeing a man. Some were uncertain about the exact time. Some details changed depending on who was telling the story. This was not unusual. Human memory is not a perfect recording device. A person witnessing something frightening may remember certain details clearly while forgetting others completely. A face seen briefly in darkness may become impossible to describe accurately hours later. The investigators understood this problem. But they had no alternative. They needed people to remember. They needed someone to have noticed something unusual. They needed one person to provide the connection that would lead them to the killer. That person never appeared. As newspapers began reporting on the murder, public attention increased. The story attracted readers because it contained all the elements that fascinated Victorian society: mystery, danger, and the possibility that a hidden criminal could exist among ordinary citizens. Reporters searched for information. Rumors spread. Descriptions of the crime became more dramatic with each retelling. The public wanted certainty. But certainty was exactly what investigators lacked. At the same time, the police were careful not to reveal every detail of the investigation. They understood that releasing too much information could interfere with their work. They also feared that false claims and public speculation could make the search more difficult. Their caution, however, could not prevent rumors. Whitechapel was a neighborhood where information traveled quickly. People talked in markets. They talked in pubs. They talked outside lodging houses. Every conversation created another possibility. Some believed the killer was a local man who knew the streets well. Others believed he was an outsider who had entered the district. Some suspected someone with medical knowledge because of the nature of the attack. Others believed the killer was simply a violent criminal who had been lucky enough to escape. The truth was that nobody knew. And uncertainty creates fear. If people know who they are afraid of, they can at least imagine how to protect themselves. An unknown threat is different. It creates endless possibilities. The person walking beside you could be harmless. Or dangerous. The stranger across the street could be a worker returning home. Or someone hiding a terrible secret. Every possibility became frightening. The murder also raised uncomfortable questions about the women living in Whitechapel. Many newspapers focused on the circumstances of their lives rather than the failures of the society surrounding them. Their poverty became part of the story. Their struggles became evidence of the dangerous environment they inhabited. But beneath those discussions was a deeper reality. These women were vulnerable because they had few protections. Their poverty placed them in situations where safety was often impossible. They walked streets late at night because they had to. They interacted with strangers because survival required it. They entered dangerous environments because there were limited alternatives. Their circumstances were not simply background information. They were part of the tragedy. Mary Ann Nichols' death revealed how exposed some members of society had become. It showed how easily someone could disappear into the shadows of a crowded city. And most frighteningly, it suggested that the killer might not have been someone who appeared unusual. He may have been someone who looked ordinary. Someone who passed through the same streets as everyone else. Someone who could disappear into the crowd after committing an unimaginable act. As September began, the investigation continued. But before the police could fully understand the significance of Mary Ann Nichols' murder, another woman would be found dead. Another street would become a crime scene. Another family would experience the same unbearable loss. And this time, investigators would begin to suspect that they were no longer dealing with a single tragedy. They were facing a pattern. The name Jack the Ripper did not exist yet. The legend had not been created. But the darkness surrounding Whitechapel was growing. The first murder had been a warning. The second would turn that warning into fear. The murder of Mary Ann Nichols had left Whitechapel unsettled, but uncertainty still allowed people to believe that perhaps the horror had ended with one terrible night. London had seen countless crimes before. People wanted to believe this was another isolated tragedy. A moment of violence caused by one individual whose identity would eventually be discovered. A case that would be solved. A name that would be placed beside a crime. A chapter that would close. But the streets of Whitechapel were about to prove otherwise. Only 8 days after Mary Ann Nichols was discovered in Bucks Row, another woman disappeared into the same darkness that had taken her. Her name was Annie Chapman. The second murder would change everything. It would transform suspicion into fear. It would convince investigators that they were not searching for an ordinary criminal. They were searching for someone whose actions followed a disturbing pattern. The morning of September 8, 1888, began like many mornings in Whitechapel. The district was already awake. Workers moved through the streets. Businesses prepared to open. Residents stepped outside into another day of uncertainty. But inside the narrow passageways behind the crowded buildings, a terrible discovery was waiting. Annie Chapman's body was found in the backyard of a house at 29 Hanbury Street. The location immediately raised difficult questions. This was not an empty street far away from all activity. It was a residential area. People lived nearby. People moved through the area regularly. Yet somehow, a violent crime had occurred there without anyone stopping it. That fact disturbed investigators. The killer was not only willing to act. He was willing to act where other people were close enough to hear. The discovery was made by residents of the building who had gone outside in the morning. The quiet routine of preparing for another day was interrupted by a scene that would forever change the history of the street. Within hours, police officers arrived. The area became crowded with investigators, residents, and curious onlookers. Whitechapel had already experienced one shocking murder. Now it had another. The possibility that these two crimes were connected became impossible to ignore. The similarities were immediately examined. Both victims were women living in poverty. Both had been attacked in the early hours. Both had been found in areas where the killer appeared able to escape quickly. Both cases suggested a level of control and planning that concerned investigators. The idea of a pattern began forming. At first, police had investigated Mary and Nichols' death as a single murder. Now they had to consider something much more frightening. Someone might be targeting vulnerable women in Whitechapel. Someone might be moving through the district with a purpose. Someone might already be searching for another victim. The investigation became more urgent. But urgency did not create answers. It only increased pressure. Detectives returned to the same problems they had faced before. No clear suspect. No confirmed eyewitness. No reliable description. No scientific evidence capable of identifying the offender. The killer remained a shadow. And shadows are difficult to arrest. As news of Annie Chapman's death spread, fear intensified among local residents. Women who had previously walked alone through the neighborhood began reconsidering their routines. People watched strangers more carefully. Every unfamiliar face became a possibility. Every rumor became another reason for anxiety. The newspapers responded immediately. The murder became a national story. Readers across Britain followed developments closely. They wanted to know who was responsible. They wanted reassurance that the person behind these crimes would be captured. But the reality facing investigators was much more complicated. The police were not dealing with a criminal who had left behind obvious evidence. They were dealing with someone who appeared to understand the environment around him. Whitechapel offered endless hiding places. The district was crowded enough to provide anonymity but fragmented enough to make tracking someone extremely difficult. A person could enter a lodging house, pay for a bed, and disappear the next morning. A stranger could walk through the streets without anyone remembering him. A resident could live nearby without becoming truly known. The environment itself protected secrets. The investigation into Annie Chapman's death also created debate about the killer's possible knowledge and behavior. Some observers believed the offender might possess medical or anatomical knowledge because of the nature of the crime. Others argued that such conclusions were exaggerated and that the killer's actions did not necessarily prove professional training. This disagreement would continue for generations. Was the killer highly intelligent? Or simply reckless? Did he carefully plan each attack? Or did he act impulsively and rely on luck? Was he someone capable of blending into society? Or someone already considered suspicious by those around him? Every question opened another possibility. Every possibility created another theory. But none brought investigators closer to a name. The most disturbing aspect was the confidence with which the killer seemed to operate. After Mary and Nichols' death, the murderer had escaped. After Annie Chapman's death, he escaped again. The message was becoming clear. Whoever was responsible believed he could move through Whitechapel without being caught. And so far, he was right. The victims, however, remained the center of the tragedy. Annie Chapman was not simply the second name in a growing list. She was a woman whose life had existed long before that morning. She had once been a daughter, a wife, a mother, someone who had known ordinary happiness before hardship changed the direction of her life. Her death represented another family loss, another empty place at a table, another person whose future had been stolen. But as investigators searched for answers, the focus of the world shifted toward the unknown figure responsible. The public wanted a monster. The newspapers wanted a story. The police wanted evidence. Yet the truth remained hidden. The person behind the murders had left behind fear, but not identity. Only questions. And those questions were about to become even more urgent. Because the most infamous night of the Whitechapel murders was approaching. A night when two women would die within hours of each other. A night that would convince London that the killer was not finished. September 30th, 1888. The night that would later become known as the Double Event. A night that would push the investigation into an entirely new level of panic. The killer had already shown that he could strike. Now he would show that he could strike twice. The first moments after a crime are often the most important. Before theories. Before rumors. Before newspapers transform events into stories. There is only the scene itself. The place where ordinary life stopped and something terrible took its place. For the Whitechapel murders, the crime scenes became silent witnesses. The streets, courtyards, and small rooms where the victims were found held the only remaining traces of what had happened. But in 1888, those traces were fragile. They existed in a world without modern forensic science, where investigators had to rely on careful observation, human testimony, and physical evidence that could easily disappear. The discovery of a body did not provide answers. It created more questions. After the deaths of Mary Ann Nichols and Annie Chapman, police officers were already aware that something unusual was happening in Whitechapel. But the events of September 30th would push the investigation into a level of urgency that nobody had experienced before. That night would produce two crime scenes, two victims, two separate locations, and a growing realization that the person responsible could move through London's streets with terrifying confidence. The evening began like many others in Whitechapel. People worked. People drank. People searched for ways to survive another difficult night. The streets were busy enough to hide movement but quiet enough that danger could appear without warning. Among those moving through the district was Elizabeth Stride. By September 1888, Elizabeth had already lived through years of hardship. Like the other women connected to the case, she was not a person who appeared suddenly in history. She carried decades of memories, relationships, and experiences before her name became associated with tragedy. On that night, she was simply another person navigating the streets of East London. She was seen in the area around Berner Street, near the International Working Men's Educational Club. The neighborhood was still active. People were coming and going. Conversations continued. Life continued. This detail would later become one of the most debated aspects of the case. How could a murder occur in an area where people were nearby? How could someone commit such an act and escape before being identified? The answer remained uncertain. Shortly before 1 o'clock in the morning, Elizabeth Stride was discovered in the courtyard of the building known as Dutfield's Yard. The discovery shocked those who found her. Once again, residents were forced to confront the possibility that the danger was not gone. The police arrived. The area was examined. Witnesses were questioned. But unlike the previous murders, something immediately appeared different. Elizabeth Stride's death did not show the same pattern of injuries associated with the earlier victims. This difference created uncertainty. Was this the same killer? Or had another violent crime occurred in Whitechapel at the same time? Investigators had to consider every possibility. The absence of certain details raised more questions than answers. Some researchers believe the killer may have been interrupted before he could continue. The location was different. The circumstances were different. People were nearby. Perhaps someone approached. Perhaps the killer heard movement. Perhaps he decided it was too risky to remain. If that theory is correct, then Elizabeth Stride may have been the victim of an interrupted attack. But history cannot confirm it. The truth remains hidden. What happened next is what transformed the night from shocking into extraordinary. While police were still processing the discovery of Elizabeth Stride, another woman was found dead less than an hour later. Her name was Catherine Eddowes. The distance between the two locations was not enormous by London standards. It was a distance that could be crossed on foot. And that possibility terrified investigators. If the same person was responsible, then the killer had moved through the city immediately after the first murder. He had not disappeared. He had continued. Catherine Eddowes was discovered in Mitre Square, an area near the City of London. Unlike Dutfield's Yard, Mitre Square presented a different environment. It was enclosed. It was quiet. It contained multiple entrances and exits. A person familiar with the area could move through it quickly. Again, the killer appeared to have chosen a location that allowed escape. The discovery of Catherine's body created a new wave of fear among investigators. 2 women. 1 night. 2 locations. 1 possible offender. The phrase double event would later be used to describe the murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes. For the police, however, it was not a dramatic title. It was a terrifying possibility. They were no longer investigating a series of separate crimes. They were facing the possibility of an individual who could kill repeatedly within hours and disappear afterward. The pressure intensified. The public demanded action. The newspapers demanded explanations. The police needed a breakthrough. But the investigation remained trapped by the same limitations. No fingerprints. No DNA. No surveillance. No reliable method to track a person through the city. The investigators had to depend on witnesses. And witnesses could only provide fragments. Someone remembered seeing a man near one location. Someone else remembered hearing voices. Another person noticed something unusual but could not be certain what they had seen. Each statement became another piece of a puzzle that refused to form a complete picture. One of the most famous pieces of evidence connected to the night was discovered after Catherine Eddowes' murder. A section of her apron was later found in another location. Near it, investigators discovered writing on a wall. The words created immediate concern. They appeared to connect the murder to broader social tensions existing within London at the time. Police feared that allowing the message to remain publicly visible could create unrest, particularly because of the possibility that it might encourage hostility toward a specific community. Before it could be properly documented and examined, the writing was removed. This decision remains controversial among historians. From a modern perspective, preserving possible evidence would seem obvious. But investigators in 1888 faced different concerns. They were not only trying to solve murders. They were also trying to prevent public disorder in an already frightened city. The result was that a potentially important clue disappeared forever. Another mystery added to many others. The double event changed the investigation permanently. Before September 30th, some people still hoped the murders might end. After September 30th, that hope became much weaker. The killer had demonstrated something terrifying. He could strike more than once. He could adapt. He could escape. And he could leave behind a city full of questions. The police now faced a criminal unlike any they had investigated before. A person who seemed to understand the weaknesses of the environment. A person who could disappear among ordinary citizens. A person whose identity remained hidden despite increasing attention. The streets of Whitechapel became filled with suspicion. People watched one another. Rumors grew. The search expanded. And then, as investigators struggled to make sense of the evidence, another element entered the story. A message. A letter. A name. A name that would transform an unknown murderer into one of the most infamous figures in criminal history. Jack the Ripper.